With tensions around Iran raising the risk of an oil shock and geopolitical shifts reshaping global supply chains, we'll look at what it all means for the evolving trade relationship between Taiwan and Japan. I'm Divya Gopalan, and Connected on TaiwanPlus is coming to you from the National Sun Yat-sen University School of Banking and Finance in southern Taiwan. Seijiro Takeshita is the Dean of the Graduate School of Management, Informatics and Innovation at the University of Shizuoka, and you're also an adjunct professor at the National Sun Yat-sen University, which is where we are right now. I'm going to start with a bigger picture look and, what's making all the headlines at the moment, which is the conflict in and around Iran. Can you tell us how that's affecting trade dynamics between Japan, Taiwan, and perhaps the whole world at the moment?
Well, it's very serious, particularly for Japan and Taiwan. Japan in particular, considering the fact that approximately 80% of oil goes through the strait. And we know there's a very serious problem there. And Japan's dependency of oil to the Middle East has reached almost 90%, which is a very negative issue from security point of view. And this nightmare is becoming true at this moment. Of course, we expect that this conflict will end in rather short term, which is what most people are expecting, and we hope that to be the case. But if it prolongs, then it will have a very negative knock-on effect, particularly in oil prices. And at the same time, our dependency to reduce this excessive risk to increase the nuclear has dropped significantly after the 2011 Great Earthquake. Our dependency of nuclear was 30%, but now it's basically down to 5%. We're starting to creep up and are targeting 20%, but still, that's not enough. So we have very heavy dependency on oil continuously.
So Taiwan is in a very similar situation, imports most of its oil, relies heavily on its industries, and also doesn't have the backup of nuclear power. Again, also they've downgraded any kind of nuclear power. So what should countries like Japan and Taiwan think about? What kind of a wake-up call is this situation for them?
It's another wake-up call about the external threat that we could always face. The industry that Japan and Taiwan is in, if, for example, semiconductor is a good example, we need stable source of energy. Well, you hear people saying, well, why don't you change alternative energy? And that might be theoretically correct, but not in absolute term, because you need a stable energy in order to basically function on a high level of precision machinery or semiconductors. So we have to rely on sources like nuclear or oil. So it's easy to say you can switch into alternative, but that's basically not possible at this moment with the technology that we have on alternative energy, and those things don't happen overnight. So that's another problem that I think both Japan and Taiwan are facing. The nature of their produce or their strength in their production capability has a very high correlation with the need of stable energy, and therefore we need oil. And for the base price for that to go up is certainly, without a doubt, a very negative issue.
It will hurt.
But it's also compounded with the psychology of the geopolitical tension that is already here, especially in Taiwan. We're getting all these unnecessary aggression from China, and on top of it, if we're getting this Middle East conflict, certainly it adds a very negative sentiment for going ahead in the future.
You mentioned China, you mentioned the US, both Japan's largest trading partners. So how would you say supply chains and perhaps Japan's trading with Taiwan has been affected by the US-China rivalry?
Well, Japan is obviously part of the free nation, coalition. So what Japan, like many other countries, been doing is to basically ward off this excessive inclination or dependency to China as far as the international, global chain is considered. So obviously we're trying to reduce that. And there's been an attempt to basically hold a kind of a blockade against, Chinese aggression through a lot of industrial areas, particularly in high-end semiconductor, for example. So, for these issues, I think Japan and Taiwan, for example, can basically hold a nice scrum with each other against these aggression that we're seeing. So I think there will be a continuous, collaboration that will take place. In fact, our Prime Minister had basically clarified that, should anything happen to Taiwan, we're with Taiwan. Japan is with Taiwan. And that really angered the Chinese authorities. And we still have a very big, strong glut about it. But, I think it was a very good wake-up call for the Japanese to realize the position that they're in. The problem with Japan and the Japanese is that it was a very pacifist nation, it still is. They thought that, we have a Ninth Amendment, we will not declare war on anybody, so nobody will declare war on us. No, 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 no. Look what's happening in Europe. The aggression that Taiwan is feeling from China. And what happens, I hope it doesn't happen, but what many people are predicting that might happen to Taiwan, if it happens, then who's next? And a lot of Japanese are now getting a wake-up call. I think a lot of Japanese companies have been very, very optimistic, excessively optimistic about, overseas investment, especially in China, has started to realize this word called country risk. To have a hypothesis that, investing in China is the same as in other free world has been very naive. And I think a lot of Japanese companies are starting to get a wake-up call on that. So, from that perspective, I think what China needs to do is something they won't do, but to start opening up, really. I think, their current policy of this aggression may last for a decade or two, but it's not going to last forever.